In the history of the ancient world, there's one woman who eclipses all others. Her name has become a byword for beauty, luxury, and excess. But more than that, her story is entwined with some of the most powerful men in Western history. She is, of course, the last pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra.
Since her death some 2,000 years ago, Cleopatra has been portrayed as everything from romantic heroine and victim to sexual predator and cold-blooded killer. Over the years, she's been subject to myth, propaganda, and more than a little fantasy.
Through 2 millennia of history, art, and fiction, she has been moulded to the fashions and prejudices of the day. And over the centuries, Cleopatra has become a blank canvas on which successive generations have projected whatever image suited their own time. During 3 decades on British screens, the BBC history series Time Watch attempted to interrogate Cleopatra's story. Along the way, Time Watch took up some of the fiercest debates that surround Cleopatra, how she looked, her relationship with men, and even the thorny issue of her race.
The dominant culture does not see Cleopatra as black and does not accept Cleopatra as black.
I'll guide you through the ever-shifting sands of Cleopatra's changing image, and by looking through the BBC archives, I'll try to piece together how the myths came about and uncover who she really was.
Despite living some 2,000 years ago, Cleopatra still looms large in our public consciousness. It's easy to see why. A young girl who inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world. A pharaoh queen who took on the might of the Roman Empire. Along the way, seducing 2 of Rome's greatest generals, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And a woman who took her own life with the help of a poisonous snake. Over the centuries, Cleopatra's been the subject of works by everyone from the great Roman poets, Renaissance authors, through Chaucer, Shakespeare, Victorian music hall, and TV drama. Each in turn has left us with a different image of who she was.
Most of us know Cleopatra and her story through the prism of popular culture. It's easy to forget that Cleopatra was a real woman who lived through some of the most important events in our history, events that would help to shape the Western and Middle Eastern worlds.
I think Cleopatra's legacy is as one of the very few great women in ancient history. One of the very few times we can point to someone and say that woman changed the world. And the fact that even a few of those characters exist makes them extremely important to us.
I think we see Cleopatra differently every time we look at her and when we're looking at her. So I think we will see her very differently from people, say, 50 years ago. It's not necessarily the right Cleopatra, though. We're always tempted, I think, to put our own interpretation and see her through the lens of our own history.
We use Cleopatra as we want, and it reflects our own assumptions, our own desires about the world, but it tends to be those desires, how we would have liked the past to be and how we'd like the present to be, rather than necessarily how either of them actually are or were.
Understanding how and why her myth came about is so important because the reality of her world has been literally buried. Surprisingly, there's little archaeological evidence for Cleopatra's life remaining in Egypt. Cleopatra has fascinated people the world over for centuries, and anything relating to her is deemed newsworthy.
Archaeologists working in the waters off the Egyptian port of Alexandria have found the remains of a royal city that was home to Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony. They say the city has lain hidden for 2,000 years on the eastern edge of the ancient harbour. They believe Cleopatra's palace, located on a peninsula nearby, looked directly across the bay to Antony's home. The royal city itself was a network of lavish palaces and temples. This report from our correspondent in Egypt, Jim Muir.
It's an underwater museum. For the first time, The whole area has finally been explored and mapped using the most sophisticated modern equipment.
Cleopatra lived on this place. She had palaces on this place, and she played this unbelievable drama between her, Julius Caesar, Antony, and Octavius, exactly on this place.
It's certainly true that between the Mediterranean Sea and the modern city of Alexandria, there's very little left of Cleopatra's city. We have some descriptions in the ancient sources, but there's not much that we can actually use to tell what her daily life was like, what life with Antony in Alexandria was like. And I think that does mean that we have to rely a lot more on the written sources and a lot more on our kind of ideas of what should have been like.
Even without much tangible evidence to go on, Cleopatra is one of the most recognisable names from the ancient world. But despite the vast power and influence she wielded in her own lifetime, the one thing that stayed with us down the centuries is the legend of her incredible beauty.
The idea that Cleopatra was beautiful is now a central part of her myth.
The overriding impression many of us share is of Cleopatra as a striking beauty who used her good looks to seduce powerful men.
This image of Cleopatra has been handed down through the generations, perhaps reaching its climax in the golden age of Hollywood.
In 1934, the legendary filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille joined centuries of other artists, poets and authors in depicting Cleopatra for his own age.
Cleopatra is a magic name, a symbol of romance and love, of power and passion and intrigue. Cleopatra has been glorified in all the arts and by writers from Plutarch here to Shakespeare to Shaw. Yet she still remains a mystery, eternal as the Sphinx.
On the silver screen, Cleopatra has been portrayed by some of the most beautiful actresses in history, perhaps most memorably by Elizabeth Taylor in the epic 1960s retelling of her story.
Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, Siren of the Nile. Her stunning beauty and notorious intrigue turned the tide of civilization.
But where does the Hollywood image of Cleopatra come from?
The beauty myth started with the Romans, who, to their dismay, found that two of their greatest leading men had fallen under her spell. In the literature that followed, she's almost without fail been cast as hauntingly alluring.
One of the most influential authors who wrote about Cleopatra's life was the biographer and historian Plutarch, who lived in the 1st century AD. Plutarch is perhaps the least flattering of all ancient writers, but even he paints her as a beguiling figure, as dramatised in this 1983 Time Watch.
Her own beauty, so we are told, was not of that incomparable kind which instantly captivates the beholder. But the charm of her presence was irresistible, and there was an attraction in her person and her talk, together with a peculiar force of character which pervaded her every word and action, and which laid all who associated with her under its spell.
But Plutarch wasn't the only ancient author who wrote about Cleopatra, and it's often the other Roman writers who've held sway. But when new evidence does emerge, the truth doesn't always seem to match up to the legend.
Now we know her as the icon of beauty from classical times, a woman whose charms bewitched Caesar and brought down the Roman Empire. But a new discovery suggests Cleopatra was no beauty at all. She apparently had bulging eyes, thin lips and a bad haircut. Robert Hall reports.
Well, for confirmation of Cleopatra's beauty, one needs look no further than the Bard. In his play Antony and Cleopatra, one of Mark Antony's servants says that his master has been turned from a triple pillar of the world into a strumpet's fool by his love for Cleopatra. Well, on this new evidence, Mark Antony may have been a trifle short-sighted. This 2,000-year-old coin does rather shatter the image. Depicting both Mark Antony and Cleopatra, it does the Egyptian queen no favours at all.
It's very difficult to find out when this idea that Cleopatra was a great beauty came into vogue. Cleopatra has a very low brow, very hooked nose, and she does look as if she's forgotten to put her teeth in.
The image of Cleopatra we can glean from coins like this is a distorted one. Firstly, because the coins themselves are of limited artistic value. Frankly, they were minted rather crudely to our modern eyes. But more importantly, ancient coins like this were more about disseminating a potent iconography rather than showing what their subjects actually looked like.
As coins aren't really that useful in getting to the true image of Cleopatra, academics have spent decades searching for other depictions of her on reliefs and, more importantly, statues. There are a number of likely candidates, but they need to be matched to known characteristics, as Oxford University
was to live in fear, and the people you feared most were your own family. You couldn't trust your brothers, your sisters, your parents. You couldn't trust your own children once they were old enough to be independent. And Cleopatra lived in that environment. The only way to survive was to make sure that no one else ever had the capacity to kill you. And in the main, the only way to do that permanently was to kill them. So, to some extent, she's a creature of her times. She was in this environment. She couldn't have been anything else. But it is worth reminding ourselves, we shouldn't view this in too romantic a haze. You know, however much we feel about her, however much we might be sympathetic to this strong, independent-minded woman in a world dominated by men, Cleopatra couldn't afford to be nice.
I think that you've got to appreciate the realities of politics in her world, and it's naive to wring your hands over what happened at that time. And I'd suggest, people should look sideways to House of Cards. It's not any better.
Judged by our modern moral code, Cleopatra certainly has blood on her hands. But this was an age where killing your rivals was par for the course, even if they were your own relatives. In Cleopatra's world, if you wanted to survive, you did what you had to do, even if that meant killing your own sister.
Over the centuries, Cleopatra has been cast as a killer, a seductress, and of course a beauty. But one of the most enduring images of her is as a tragically doomed lover. And for this image, we have one rather well-known playwright to thank.
Our separation so abides and flies, that thou residing here goes yet with me.
William Shakespeare has a lot to answer for when it comes to how we view Cleopatra. His play, Antony and Cleopatra, has almost come to define the persona and the story we most closely associate with her today. He transformed her image from the whoring foreigner of the Romans to the tragic romantic heroine of the English Renaissance, seen through the lens of her doomed love affair with Mark Antony.
However, the reality of their relationship is rather different, and Cleopatra was anything but a star-crossed lover. After Caesar's murder, Cleopatra needed a new protector, so she turned to Caesar's protégé, Mark Antony, who now ruled the eastern half of the Roman world. They met at Tarsus in modern-day Turkey.
And we'll go to Tarsus in a barge, the most beautiful ever seen.
Cleopatra's famous arrival at Tarsus in a golden barge was designed to appeal to Antony's love of luxury. Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing and what Antony could do.
Think of Cleopatra very much as someone who is passionate and who is ruled by her heart. And it's something that the Romans also promoted. They weren't particularly keen on portraying her as an astute, sensible politician. They wanted to show her as a weak woman who was falling into all the feminine traps of not thinking logically, being ruled by her heart. We like that too. We still find it difficult to accept powerful women who behave in a logical way.
With Antony and Cleopatra, the romance always tends to loom large. After all, there aren't many romances between two people who are important political leaders. And it's the politics that tends to suffer as a result, because when you're looking at the human drama, you're looking at the passion, you're looking at their suicides so close to each other after they've suffered defeat, then it's all about that, but you forget the context of it all. Cleopatra depended throughout her life on having Roman backing. She needed to make sure that she stayed alive, which meant staying queen. The only way to do that was to get the Romans to back you. Egypt was not meaningfully independent at this point. It was very much part of Rome's sphere of influence. The problem is the Romans keep having civil wars, so you never know which lot of Romans you've got to get to support you.
Seemingly under her spell, Mark Antony openly pushed Cleopatra's agenda. The historian Plutarch summed up how the Romans now viewed their relationship.
Such being Antony's nature, the love for Cleopatra that now entered his life came as the final and crowning mischief that could befall him. It excited to the point of madness many passions that had hitherto lain concealed, and stifled and corrupted all those qualities in him that were still capable of resisting temptation.
Now, this coin, minted at Antioch, exemplifies Roman fears. It shows on one side Antony and on the other Cleopatra. In 2 successive settlements, Antony redrew the map of the East. In 37 BC, he gave to Cleopatra what had once comprised the Ptolemaic Empire, the richest cities of the Middle East. 3 years later, in a triumphal ceremony in Alexandria, he recognized as his own the children Cleopatra had borne by him. He gave their daughter, named Cleopatra the Moon, aged 6, Libya and Crete. Her twin, Alexander the Sun, was made ruler of Media. Their other son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was made king of Asia Minor.
Cleopatra had reached the zenith of her power. She'd saved Egypt, and her children would now rule most of the eastern Mediterranean. Now, she hadn't done all this just by being the romantic heroine of Shakespeare or the sexy temptress the Romans like to write her off as. Instead, the evidence suggests that she was a hard-headed and canny politician who knew how to get what she wanted. But this isn't the enduring image we're left with, because the romantic fantasy is quite simply an easier story to sell.
For nearly 2 millennia, mostly male authors have defined Cleopatra almost exclusively through her relationships with powerful men, rather than judging her on her own merit.
What's often missed in the retelling of Cleopatra's story is her real skill as a leader and ruler. Her father had squandered a fortune bribing Rome not to invade, so when she came to the throne, Cleopatra found her country almost bankrupt. But she'd been raised to rule. She had a very clear understanding of how to govern her country and how to get her economy back on track.
In the Western tradition, her skill and intelligence is often missing from her story, or simply seen as another part of her deviousness. However, that's not how all cultures see this Egyptian queen.
In the Islamic world, which was largely free of Roman propaganda about Cleopatra, she's seen in a very different light. Islamic authors hail her as a virtuous scholar and focus on her positive traits, her skill as an administrator, her comfort discussing science with some of the great thinkers of the day, and as a polymath who could master everything from mathematics to philosophy.
The Islamic historian al-Masudi, who lived in the 10th century, wrote a positive account of her intellectual ability and described Cleopatra as a sage, a philosopher who elevated the ranks of scholars and enjoyed their company. She wrote books on medicine, charms and cosmetics, in addition to many other books ascribed to her, which are known to those who practice medicine. It's surprising to realise how, in a culture different and separate from our own, the Cleopatra we all think we know is someone altogether different. In the Eastern world, Cleopatra is not only acknowledged as an intellectual, but also as having a clear vision for her country and a burning desire to make it a world power once again.
Well, she's certainly, I mean, Cleopatra's seen in a much more positive light in the medieval Arabic sources. She's seen as a very great ruler, a very clever woman, a great architect, scientist. She's supposed to have been a doctor of some kind, conducted medical experiments and so on. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And there's a difference in a culture that can appreciate a woman ruler in that way. But I think it's also interesting that these sources are often from Egypt itself, and so in a sense she's a national heroine by that stage.
In the 1920s, some Arabs even embraced Cleopatra as an icon of their nationalist cause. The Egyptian playwright Ahmed Shawki painted the Queen as a nationalist heroine who dedicated her life to defending her country from the evils of Roman imperialism. When he wrote his play, The Death of Cleopatra, Egypt was under British colonial rule, so it made perfect sense to adopt Cleopatra, who also had resisted Western imperialism. Just as Cleopatra became an icon for Arab nationalists in the 1920s, later in the 20th century, she also became the subject of a fierce debate about racial identity. When Time Watch explored Cleopatra's life in the 1990s, it did so amidst...
Cleopatra becomes a dream. Cleopatra becomes an alternative. And she's obviously especially appealing for anyone who decides they don't really like what actually happened. So you get all sorts of claims about how wonderful the world would have been if Antony and Cleopatra had only won. No real basis for them, A, because obviously they lost, but also she didn't champion any particular causes. She wasn't particularly popular with her own people because she couldn't afford to be. She didn't have time to waste on that sort of thing. She didn't really make any major contributions to Greco-Roman culture in a wider sense, apart from being spectacular and dying in this way. So our legacy is very much of the fame and the romance and the drama. There's very little that's concrete about her because in the end she lost.
In a sense, she's left us with a puzzle because our skepticism as we go into the evidence for what we've been told about her draws us on to unpicking what is propaganda and to seeking more deeply into what is actually evidence.
I think you could see Cleopatra as a blank canvas that people have projected their own images onto. But the truth is, there's so much evidence from the Roman sources, so many opinions about her, so much information about her, that I think what we're actually tempted to do is to project Roman views onto that canvas she left us.
We might never know the real Cleopatra. 2 millennia of myth, propaganda, and dramatic license may well have buried the truth forever. But over time, even that fictional character, who she is, what she represents, has changed. To the Romans, an evil Eastern harlot crushed by moral Rome. To the Islamic world, an enlightened ruler and a scholar.
But for audiences watching everything from Shakespeare to Hollywood blockbusters, one image has tended to hold sway. The archetypal femme fatale, beautiful and sexy, but with a romantic, tragic twist.
Everyone has a different image of Cleopatra in their mind's eye. A strong woman of colour, a star-crossed lover, a scheming seductress, or a ravishing beauty. But it's important to remember that underneath these superficial labels, Cleopatra was a real woman. A woman who ruled one of the greatest civilizations in the ancient world. A woman who died trying to save her kingdom from Roman domination. And the fact that it was the writings of her Roman enemies that guaranteed her fame is perhaps the ultimate testament to just how remarkable a woman she really was.
Meet the maverick who rescued the pyramids from the plunder of tomb raiders, the man who discovered Egypt, here on BBC4 next.